Scripture for the message is James 5, verses 7 through 12. Be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job. You've seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. May God bless the reading of his word. There's a little praise chorus that's based on scripture that says, in his time, he makes all things beautiful in his time. This is describing God's plan for the world in Jesus. Things don't necessarily look very beautiful for us in our lives now, but the faith that trusts in God says that he is indeed making all things beautiful according to his time and will. This is a call for patience for us. It's a holding to a vision of hope that we have where God doesn't merely just make everything right in a simple black and white, right and wrong legal sense, but he goes further and he actually makes everything beautiful, everything glorious in his time. There's an old word in English for patience. It used to be long suffering. And I like that word because of thinking about enduring times now when things are hard and they don't seem to be very beautiful, maybe in our life or someone close to us, and yet still believing that God is indeed making everything beautiful. That's what our text lifts up for us today, as James starts out, be long-suffering, brethren, up until the coming of the Lord, all the way until the last day. He uses the example of a farmer who has to be patient while his seeds are growing to maturity. And in that part of the world, there was an early rain and then a later rain, and you had to wait until then, till the plants were going to reach maturity. And so he says, you also be long-suffering, strengthening your hearts. Strengthening their hearts for what? Well, in the next phrase helps us, not groaning against one another. To me, that means, well, we're all experiencing hard times. It's tempting in hard times to say, well, it's your fault, or it's your fault, and start blaming other people, groaning against them. And so he says, don't do that, because the true judge stands at the door. We don't want to be rightly accused of judging our brother or sister when we're not the judge. James mentions the prophets. He says they're an example both of suffering and long-suffering. We call them blessed as they endure. And even Job, he said, you've heard how he endured and suffered so greatly, and yet God's goal for him was greater than before he experienced the suffering at the start. And then he concludes with saying, in patience, we let our yes be yes and our no be no. Instead of trying to control our own lives by swearing upon something or another, heaven or earth or anything else, thinking that somehow we can make something come to pass because we swear on it, he says, no, we just live in patience. And we trust that God is going to bring about beautiful things in our lives. Now, next week's text is going to talk more about types of patience and things we can do. But we can see here that the whole Christian life is supposed to be one of patience. Long-suffering, enduring whatever comes our way for now, trusting the God who is making our life and all things beautiful. Let's hear how Walter Harter met someone who lived in this patient endurance. Walter wasn't without a clue as to this kind of long suffering. As far as his perspective, he always wanted to see life as a painting, where if you stand too close to the painting, it just looks like a bunch of blobs, he said, but if you would go to the right distance and see from the right perspective, suddenly you see how the whole picture comes together and you can see why each brushstroke has been placed just in the place where it has by the painter. And so he wanted to be able to see the interrelation that happens in our lives as God is the painter. Walter also certainly had suffering. He had had polio when he was younger and still was living with the effects of that. He had endurance. He was able, even in the midst of this handicap, he was able to work in New York City for 15 years. But now he was returning to his hometown, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. His parents were aging. They needed him to be around a little closer to home. And he had a plan. He said he'd always dabbled in photography. He would turn his kitchen or his bathroom into this quick makeshift darkroom every now and then when he wanted to develop pictures. Well, now he was coming back and starting at his parents'. Their whole basement wasn't being used, and so that could be a permanent darkroom. With money he had saved up, he was able to furnish it, and he even had a second-hand enlarger for his pictures. And then he went around the neighborhood, around his parents, and he just started taking pictures of children everywhere. He was trying to develop a portfolio that he'd be able to show people later. He went to the library and he read every book they had on photography and learned as much as he could. This was way back in the 1930s. I guess people went to the library more back then. He began then knocking on doors. And if there were children at home, he would take their picture for free, and then he would come back a few days later. He would show them the proofs, and if the parents liked any of them, he showed them a modest price list that he had for enlargements and what sizes, and if not, then everything was free, and it wouldn't cost anything. His business grew slowly because he spent so much time going door to door and knocking. But that's when he met Nelson Fortner. It was just another house on his rounds on one day. "Come in," the man said. "Can't buy whatever you might be selling, but I welcome the sound of a voice." Nelson was in a chair all by himself in the house, in the living room. Said he'd worked at a bank for years, had a wife and 2 sons, and he bought this small house. But then 5 years before, he had a stroke, and it paralyzed him from the waist down. He was stable now, but just couldn't use his legs at all. There was many medical bills from all of this, and so he had to mortgage the house. His wife went to work at a department store. The 2 sons were both seniors in high school, and they got part-time jobs after class. The wife would hurry home at noon just to feed Nelson his lunch and then go back to the department store. The sons in the evening would carry him from the front room into the bedroom, and then in the morning back from the bedroom into the front room before they left for school. And though Nelson might have been tempted to think he was just a piece of furniture now, being moved around in different places, he wasn't despondent, Walter said. His outlook was amazing. He never gave up hope. Sometime, Nelson would say, things will change. Sometime, things are going to get better. Walter would visit him often when he was making his rounds knocking on doors. His cheerfulness was like a tonic to me, and he made my own affliction seem insignificant. One day, Walter got an idea. There was a phone that had been placed next to Nelson's chair. This is again back in 1930s, no cell phones or anything, so landline that's there so he could take messages for his wife or the 2 sons. And And Walter got the idea that, well, what if he could make calls for Walter? Back then we had these big phone books. He said they just give him a phone book and start in the A's and just start calling everybody. If there were children in the house, ask if Walter would be able to come and take pictures for free, and then they would be able to do the proofs, and then if they wanted to buy something, otherwise the whole sitting was free. He said that he would give Nelson $1 for each appointment that he made, whether or not he ended up selling pictures to them or not. Well, Nelson agreed to do this, and the business immediately grew because Walter didn't have to spend so much time knocking on door to door. He could spend more time with the pictures themselves. So Nelson was able to help in this way. The business grew so much, though, that Walter was able to open a shop in the downtown district and have a little studio there. Didn't really need to do at-home appointments, but he didn't want to hurt Nelson's income. And so he just continued to do it, and then after the studio in the afternoon, he went and he would do his at-home appointments that Nelson had made for him in the evening. But then Walter got another idea. He ran into a friend of his that he had known back in New York City, and a man who was a doctor. He wanted to stop and chat for a while, but the man was just too rushed. He said no one was at home for the moment, and he's afraid he was going to miss too many calls from his patients. Then Walter thought, well, what if someone if those calls could be redirected to someone else whenever the doctor was away from home? Now, this was before anybody had thought of telephone answering services, where we knew about those many years later, where things got rerouted. He mentioned the idea to Nelson. He was willing to try. Walter looked in the phone book. There was 40 doctors listed, and 15 of them were willing to pay $5 a month to Nelson for the service. It was immediate success. And then eventually Nelson on his own branched out. He contacted electricians and plumbers and other professionals and got some of them to make use of his answering service. After 4 years, his wife quit her job at the department store because she could work full-time just doing his bookwork for him and the paperwork of getting all of these appointments set up. They were able to add a small room to the house, and Nelson was able to buy a wheelchair so he didn't have to have his sons carrying him back and forth morning and night, but now he could wheel himself into this new addition room of the house and his office that he would have there. He even bought a car where he didn't have to make use of his feet at all, and so he could drive completely with his hands. Walter said it was sometime during this time when he was driving, Nelson was able to drive a car, that they would happen to meet at an intersection or pass on the street, and he said that Nelson would always give Walter a 3-finger salute or wave. And Walter wasn't sure of his significance. Well, after 15 years of having this answering service, Nelson suffered a massive stroke. Walter went to visit him often in the hospital, and he was always greeted with that 3-finger salute. During Nelson's final days and Walter's last visit to him, he finally had to know, and so he asked him what's the meaning of this gesture. And Nelson could barely talk above a whisper. He said, "I thought you knew. The second one is you, Walter. The third is me. And surely you know who is first." We made quite a trio. As Walter left, he thought, I suddenly understood why I had come back home, why I had knocked on his door, why the idea for the answering service came to me. God was in the process of painting beautiful lives. Why could Nelson and Walter be so patient with the afflictions that they had to deal with every day? It's because they have a vision of hope in His time. In His time. He makes all things beautiful in His time. This is a call for patience for us. Someday we'll see life from the right perspective. And then we'll be able to see that God has made the life of each and every one of us, the life of all things,